Have you ever noticed that the most powerful forces in nature seem to contradict each other, and yet they work together in perfect harmony? Like fire and water, like the sun that burns so bright it creates the very moisture that falls as rain, or like the lightning that splits the sky but brings the electricity that powers your home tonight. I want to share with you a sacred paradox that Florence Scovel Shinn discovered over 100 years ago in New York City when she was working with people who had lost everything and yet found everything. When they understood that divine wealth is not money that comes to you, but fire that burns within you, like a flame that never goes out, even when surrounded by the deepest waters of apparent lack and scarcity. This fire I speak of is not metaphor, but actual spiritual energy that exists right now within your being, waiting to be activated, and when it ignites, it transforms everything around you. Not because you become a different person, but because you remember who you have always been, which is a divine being temporarily having a human experience. And in this human experience, you have been taught that wealth comes from outside, from jobs, from investments, from other people, from luck, from timing. But Florence Scovel Shinn discovered that true wealth, the kind that never leaves you, the kind that cannot be taken away, the kind that multiplies when you share it, this wealth comes from the fire within the water of your consciousness. And tonight, while you sleep, this fire will begin to burn brighter than it has ever burned before. You can close your eyes now if you have not already, and everything that needs to happen will happen while you rest. And if you fall asleep during this teaching, that is perfect, because your subconscious mind never sleeps, and it will absorb every word I speak. And when you wake in the morning, something will be different. Not because the world changed, but because the fire within you has been fanned into a flame that cannot be extinguished by any circumstance, any economy, any person, any fear. Because this fire burns on divine fuel, and divine fuel is infinite and inexhaustible. Let me tell you about Evelyn, who was 54 years old when she first heard these words, and her story will show you exactly what I mean about the fire within the water. Evelyn lived in a small apartment in Denver, Colorado, and it was March 15th when her life changed forever. The time was exactly 6:37 in the morning, and she had been awake all night staring at the stack of bills on her kitchen table, bills that totaled $8,467, and she had exactly $93 in her checking account and $12 in cash in her purse. The apartment was cold because she had turned the heat down to save money, and the morning light was that gray kind of light that comes through windows when the sky is cloudy and everything feels hopeless. The air smelled like the instant coffee she had made with yesterday's grounds because she was trying to make everything last longer. And the silence in the apartment was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it is pressing down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. Evelyn had been a secretary for 32 years at the same insurance company, and 3 months earlier, the company had been sold and her position had been eliminated. And at 54, she was finding that nobody wanted to hire a secretary of her age because they all wanted young people who knew computers better, and her unemployment benefits were running out in 2 weeks, and her savings were already gone, and she felt like she was drowning in a sea of financial worry and fear. She had always been responsible with money, always paid her bills on time, always lived within her means, but somehow life had happened anyway. Her mother had gotten sick 2 years before, and Evelyn had used her savings to help pay for care. And then her car had broken down and needed a $2,000 repair, and then the roof of her apartment building had leaked and damaged her furniture, and she had to replace it, and one thing after another, until she found herself in this place where no matter how hard she tried, no matter how many applications she filled out, no matter how much she prayed in the traditional way, nothing seemed to work. That morning, as she sat in her kitchen with those bills spread out in front of her, she felt something inside her break, not in a bad way, but like something that had been holding back a river suddenly gave way, and in that moment, she heard a voice, not audible but clear, as if someone was sitting right next to her, speaking directly into her ear. And the voice said, "The fire within the water never goes out," and she had no idea what it meant, but something about those words made her feel like she was not alone anymore. Later that same day, Evelyn was at the library using their free internet to look for jobs when she stumbled across a video about Florence Scovel Shinn and the teaching about divine wealth, and as she listened, she began to understand what the voice had meant that morning. The fire was the divine energy within her, the eternal flame of her connection to infinite supply. And the water was her willingness to surrender to flow, to stop trying to force solutions, and instead become receptive to the solutions that were already prepared for her. That night, March 15th, at exactly 9:45 in the evening, Evelyn spoke these words out loud in her empty apartment. I am not separate from divine supply. I am the place where divine supply expresses itself, and I do not need to figure out how this works. I only need to become the fire within the water and allow myself to burn with the certainty that I am provided for in ways I cannot yet see. She had no idea that speaking those words would activate something in the invisible realm that would begin to rearrange her entire reality, but that is exactly what happened, because the next morning, March 16th at 7:23 in the morning, her phone rang, and it was her former supervisor from the insurance company calling to tell her that the new owners had decided to bring back some of the experienced staff, and they wanted to offer her a position at a salary that was $1,500 more per month than she had been making before. But that was just the beginning, because 3 days later on March 19th, she received a letter in the mail informing her that she was inheriting $4,000 from an aunt. She barely knew who had died 6 months earlier, and the paperwork had just been processed, and the check would arrive within 10 days. And then the following week, her landlord knocked on her door to tell her that he was reducing her rent by $200 per month because he appreciated having such a reliable tenant and wanted to make sure she could stay. Within 30 days of speaking those words about being the fire within the water, Evelyn had gone from being $8,467 in debt with no income to having a job that paid more than her old job, plus $4,000 in unexpected inheritance, plus lower rent, which meant she had an extra $1,700 per month compared to where she had been before. And when I interviewed Evelyn 6 months later, she told me that the most amazing thing was not the money itself, but the way she felt about money. Now, she said, I used to think that money was something outside of me that I had to chase and catch and hold on to tightly. But now I understand that money is just energy, and I am connected to the source of all energy. So money flows to me naturally, like water flows downhill. And when I spend money, I know more is coming, because the fire within me never stops burning. And this fire attracts its own fuel, which is opportunities and ideas and connections and synchronicities and all the things that create wealth in the physical world. The most powerful part of Evelyn's story is that she never went back to financial struggle after that, not because her outer circumstances were perfect, but because she had learned to access the fire within the water. And once you know how to do that, once you know how to be the place where divine supply expresses itself, instead of the person who chases after supply, then you become magnetic to wealth in all its forms, and you realize that you were never separate from abundance. You were just temporarily forgetting your true nature. If this teaching resonates with you, and if you feel you were guided here tonight, then touch the subscribe button now, and it is not for me, but it is so that you receive each new teaching from Florence Scovel Shinn at the exact moment your soul needs it. And these teachings come through regularly, and each one builds upon the last one, creating a foundation of spiritual understanding that will transform not just your relationship with money, but your entire experience of being alive in this physical world. And in the comments, write only these 4 words, which are the fire burns bright. And this is not just a comment, but a decree. And when you write these words, you join your energy with thousands of other souls who are activating the same fire within themselves. And together, we create a field of manifestation that benefits everyone who enters it, because spiritual energy multiplies when it is shared. And the more people who remember their connection to divine supply, the easier it becomes for everyone to access that same supply. If you choose not to do this right now, that is perfectly fine, and your path is your own. But know that this moment while you are hearing these words is a moment of great power, and the fire within you is already responding to what you are hearing. So if you feel moved to subscribe and comment, then trust that feeling, because it is your inner wisdom guiding you toward greater alignment with your true abundant nature. Now you can relax completely, and you do not need to do anything else except listen and receive. And if you fall asleep, that is perfect, because everything I share will enter your subconscious mind while you rest, and your subconscious mind is always awake and always listening, and it knows exactly how to take the seeds of truth I am planting and grow them into a garden of manifestation in your life. And you will wake up tomorrow, and things will begin to shift in small ways at first, and then in larger ways as the fire within you burns brighter and attracts more fuel to keep burning. The fire within the water is not just a beautiful metaphor. It is a description of the actual spiritual technology that Florence Scovel Shinn discovered and taught. And tonight, while you sleep, this technology is being activated within your consciousness, and you do not need to understand how it works. You only need to allow it to work and trust that the same intelligence that grows flowers from tiny seeds and turns acorns into mighty oak trees is now working in your life to transform your relationship with abundance from one of struggle and fear to one of flow and faith. As you continue to rest and allow these words to enter the deepest parts of your consciousness, I want to take you back in time to New York City in the year 1918, when the world was emerging from a great war and people everywhere were trying to rebuild their lives and their fortunes. And in a small apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan there lived a woman named Florence Scovel Shinn, who had stumbled upon something that would change not only her own life, but the lives of thousands of people who would come to her seeking answers to their most pressing problems. Florence was born in 1860 in Camden, New Jersey, to a family of modest means, and she grew up in a world where women had very few opportunities to support themselves financially. But Florence had always been drawn to art and beauty and spiritual things, and by the time she moved to New York City, she had established herself as an illustrator, working for magazines and book publishers. But like many creative people, she struggled to make ends meet and often found herself worrying about money and wondering if she would ever feel truly secure. It was during one of these periods of financial difficulty that Florence first encountered the ancient teaching that would become the foundation of everything she would later share with the world she was walking through Central Park. On a cold November afternoon in 1917, trying to clear her mind and figure out how she was going to pay her rent when she stopped to rest on a bench near the reservoir, and sitting next to her was an elderly man who seemed to sense her distress. The man was well-dressed but not ostentatious, and he had the kind of presence that made you feel calm just being near him. And after a few minutes of sitting in comfortable silence, he turned to Florence and said, "My dear, you look like someone who is carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders." And Florence found herself telling this stranger about her financial worries and her fears about the future. And when she finished speaking, the man smiled and said something that would echo in her mind for the rest of her life. He said, "The ancient teachers knew something that we have forgotten in our modern world. They knew that wealth is not something you acquire, but something you remember you already have. And the fire of divine abundance burns within every soul. But most people have covered this fire with so many layers of doubt and fear and false beliefs that they cannot feel its warmth anymore. But the fire is still there waiting to be uncovered. And when you remember how to fan this fire into flame, you discover that you have always been wealthy. You just forgot how to access your wealth." Florence asked the man what he meant by fanning the fire into flame, and he told her about the power of the spoken word. Not just any words, but words spoken with the authority of truth words that align with divine law rather than human limitation. And he explained that when you speak as if you are already the person you want to become rather than the person you think you are, then you activate invisible forces that begin to rearrange your outer circumstances to match your inner conviction. The man told Florence that the ancient teachers called this the law of correspondence, as above, so below, as within, so without. And he said that if you want to change what is happening in your external world, you must first change what is happening in your internal world. and the fastest way to change your internal world is through the careful and deliberate use of words that carry the vibration of truth rather than the vibration of fear. Florence spent the next several months experimenting with this teaching, and what she discovered amazed her, because every time she spoke words that aligned with divine truth rather than human appearance, something in her external circumstances would shift to match her words, and gradually she began to understand that she had been given access to a spiritual technology that had been used by mystics and teachers throughout history, but had been largely forgotten in the modern world. One of the first major demonstrations of this principle in Florence's life involved a man named Harrison, who was 62 years old and had come to see her in the spring of 1918. Harrison lived in Brooklyn with his wife, Martha, and their grown daughter, and he had worked for 43 years as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company that made buttons and fasteners for clothing companies. But the war had disrupted the supply of materials, and the company was struggling, and Harrison had been told that his position would be eliminated at the end of the month. Harrison was a man who had always prided himself on being practical and logical, and he had very little patience for what he called mystical nonsense, but his daughter had heard about Florence from a friend and had convinced him to come see her as a last resort because he was 59 years old and nobody wanted to hire a bookkeeper of his age, and he was terrified that he would not be able to provide for his family. When Harrison came to see Florence on a rainy Thursday afternoon in April, he was wearing his best suit, which was threadbare at the elbows, and his shoes, which had been resoled twice, and he sat in her small parlor with his hat in his hands, looking like a man who had given up hope. And when Florence asked him to tell her about his situation, he spoke in the flat, toneless voice of someone who has repeated the same story of limitation so many times that he believes it more than he believes in any possibility of change. Harrison told Florence that he had saved some money over the years, but not enough to retire, and that his wife had a weak heart and could not work, and that their daughter was unmarried and had been helping to support them. But she could not support all three of them on her salary as a seamstress, and he said that he had applied for 17 different positions and had been turned down for all of them because employers wanted younger men who could work for lower wages, and he felt like he was trapped in a situation with no way out. Florence listened to Harrison's story with compassion, but when he finished speaking, she said something that startled him. She said, "Harrison, everything you have just told me is a perfect description of human limitation, but it has nothing to do with divine possibility. And you have been speaking words of limitation for so long that you have hypnotized yourself into believing that limitation is the only reality. But there is another reality available to you if you are willing to learn a new way of speaking." She explained to Harrison that his real problem was not his age or the economy or his lack of connections, but his unconscious allegiance to the belief that security comes from human effort rather than divine supply, and she told him that as long as he continued to speak and think as if he were a victim of circumstances, he would continue to create circumstances that victimized him. But if he could learn to speak and think as if he were a beloved child of an infinitely abundant universe, then the universe would begin to demonstrate that abundance in his life. Harrison was skeptical, but desperate enough to try anything. So Florence taught him a simple practice. She told him that every morning when he woke up and every night before he went to sleep, he should speak these words out loud. "I am not looking for a job because I am the perfect job expressing itself through the perfect employer at the perfect time for the perfect compensation." And then she told him that during the day, whenever he caught himself thinking thoughts of worry or limitation, he should immediately replace those thoughts with this statement: "My divine right employment is seeking me now, and it cannot be delayed or denied." Florence explained to Harrison that these were not affirmations trying to convince him of something that was not true, but rather decrees that aligned his consciousness with what was already true in the divine plan. And she told him that the fire of divine supply was already burning within him, but it had been dampened by years of speaking words that contradicted divine law, and now he needed to use his words to fan that fire back into full flame. Harrison agreed to try this practice, even though he felt foolish speaking such words. And Florence told him that feeling foolish was actually a good sign, because it meant he was stepping outside of his familiar patterns of thinking and speaking and entering new territory where miracles could happen. And she assured him that he did not need to believe the words. At first, he only needed to speak them consistently and allow them to do their work. For the first week, Harrison felt like he was lying to himself every time he spoke those words, because his outer circumstances had not changed, and he was still unemployed and still worried about money. But Florence had warned him that there would be a period of time when his inner work would not yet be reflected in his outer world, and she told him to persist through this period because the invisible realm always responds to consistent spiritual effort, even when that response is not immediately visible. On the 10th day of speaking his decree, something interesting happened. Harrison was walking to the post office to mail another letter of inquiry about employment when he encountered his former employer, Mr. Patterson, on the street. And instead of feeling embarrassed about his unemployment, Harrison found himself feeling confident and peaceful, as if he knew something good was about to happen. And when Mr. Patterson asked him how he was doing, Harrison heard himself saying, "I am very well, thank you, and my perfect employment is manifesting now, Mr." Patterson looked surprised and said, "Harrison, I am glad to hear you are so optimistic, because I have been thinking about you and wondering if you might be interested in a proposition. I have been offered a partnership in a new company that will be importing materials from Europe now that the war is over, and I need someone I can trust to manage the financial side of the business. And I immediately thought of you because of your experience and your integrity." Within 2 weeks, Harrison had gone from being unemployed at 62 years old to being a partner in a business that would provide him with more income than he had ever earned as an employee. And when he came back to see Florence to tell her what had happened, he was a changed man, not just because of his improved circumstances, but because he had discovered that there was a power within him that he had never known existed. Harrison told Florence that the most amazing thing was not that he had found perfect employment, but that he had found it without any effort on his part. All he had done was change his words, and the universe had rearranged itself to match his new way of speaking. And he said that for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to live by faith rather than by sight, because he had seen with his own eyes that there was an invisible reality that was far more reliable than the visible world of appearances. This experience with Harrison became one of the foundational stories that Florence would share for the rest of her life, because it demonstrated so clearly the principle that she had learned from the man in Central Park: the fire of divine abundance burns within every soul. But most people have buried this fire under layers of limitation and fear and doubt, and the way to uncover the fire is through the consistent use of words that align with divine truth rather than human appearance. Florence came to understand that the fire within the water was not just a poetic metaphor, but an actual description of how consciousness works. The fire represents the divine spark within every soul, the eternal flame of our connection to infinite supply, and the water represents the fluidity and receptivity that allows that divine fire to express itself in the world of form. And when you learn to be both fire and water, both passionate about your divine right to abundance and receptive to the ways that abundance wants to express itself through you, then you become a magnet for every good thing. Principle that Florence discovered, and that Harrison demonstrated in his life, is that divine wealth does not come to you from outside sources, but flows through you from the infinite source within. And this flow is activated not by effort or struggle, but by alignment. And this alignment is achieved through the conscious and consistent use of words that acknowledge your true relationship to the source of all supply, which is not a relationship of separation and need, but a relationship of unity and abundance. While you sleep tonight, this same principle is working in your consciousness, because your subconscious mind does not know the difference between what you speak out loud and what you hear spoken with authority. And every word I am speaking to you now is being absorbed by the deepest levels of your being, where it will begin to dissolve old patterns of limitation and activate new patterns of abundance. And you will wake up tomorrow with a slightly different relationship to money and wealth and supply, because the fire within you will be burning a little brighter than it was when you went to sleep. As you continue to rest in this space of deep receptivity, I want to share with you one of the most profound discoveries that Florence Scovel Shinn made during her years of working with people who were struggling with money. And that discovery was that there are actually two completely different types of wealth operating in this world. And most people spend their entire lives chasing after the wrong type of wealth, while remaining completely unconscious of the type of wealth that could transform their lives in ways they never imagined possible. The first type of wealth is what Florence called human wealth, and this is the wealth that comes from human effort and human planning and human struggle and human worry. And this type of wealth is always temporary and always uncertain, because it depends on external circumstances that are constantly changing, like the economy and the job market, and other people's decisions, and your health and your age, and 1,000 other factors that are completely outside of your control. And this is why people who have accumulated human wealth often feel anxious and insecure, even when they have more money than they could spend in a lifetime, because somewhere deep inside, they know that what came through human effort could be lost through human circumstances. But the second type of wealth is what Florence called divine wealth, and this wealth operates according to completely different laws and principles. And this wealth does not come from human effort, but from spiritual alignment. And it does not depend on external circumstances, but on internal consciousness. And it cannot be lost or stolen or diminished, because it flows from an infinite source that exists beyond the world of form. And when you learn to access divine wealth, you discover that you have been connected to unlimited abundance all along. You just did not know how to open the valve that allows that abundance to flow into your physical experience. Florence discovered that the difference between these two types of wealth is like the difference between trying to fill a bucket with a teaspoon versus connecting a hose to a fire hydrant. The teaspoon approach requires enormous effort and produces very limited results, while the fire hydrant approach requires very little effort but produces results that are far beyond what most people think is possible. And the key to connecting your life to the fire hydrant of divine abundance is understanding what Florence called the alchemy of spiritual wealth. Let me tell you about Maxine, who was 58 years old when she learned about this distinction between human wealth and divine wealth. And her story will show you exactly what I mean about the alchemy that transforms spiritual consciousness into material abundance. Maxine lived in a small town in Ohio called Marietta, and she had been married to her husband Carl for 34 years. And together, they had built what most people would consider a successful life. Carl owned a hardware store that had been in his family for 3 generations, and Maxine worked as a nurse at the local hospital, and they owned their home and had raised 2 children who were now adults with families of their own. But in the autumn of 2008, when Maxine was 57, everything that they had worked so hard to build began to fall apart. The economic crisis hit their small town particularly hard, and people stopped spending money on home improvement projects, which meant that Carl's hardware store was struggling to stay afloat. And at the same time, the hospital where Maxine worked was being bought by a larger corporation that was laying off older nurses and replacing them with younger nurses who would work for lower wages. By December of that year, both Maxine and Carl had lost their jobs, and they were facing the possibility of losing their home because they had used most of their savings to keep the hardware store running for as long as possible, hoping that business would pick up, but it never did. And now they were 67 years old and 58 years old respectively, with no income and very few prospects for finding new employment at their ages in a small town where everyone was struggling. Maxine told me later that the worst part was not the financial stress, although that was certainly difficult, but the feeling of helplessness and the sense that they had done everything right and followed all the rules and worked hard their entire lives, and yet somehow they had ended up in a situation where they could lose everything through no fault of their own. And she said that she felt like she was drowning in an ocean of circumstances that were completely beyond her control. It was during this dark time that Maxine's sister Patricia, who lived in California, sent her a book about Florence Scovel Shinn and the teachings about divine abundance. And at first, Maxine was skeptical because she had always been a practical person who believed in hard work and careful planning, and the idea that there was some kind of spiritual wealth that you could access through consciousness seemed too good to be true, and frankly, a little bit ridiculous. But she was desperate enough to try anything, so she began reading the book, and what she discovered was that Florence Scovel Shinn was not talking about wishful thinking or positive thinking, or trying to convince yourself that everything was fine when it clearly was not. Instead, she was talking about a very specific spiritual technology that could be used to align your consciousness with laws that operate beyond the physical world, laws that most people are completely unaware of, but that are just as real and reliable as the law of gravity. The first thing that struck Maxine was Florence's teaching that divine wealth is not something you create, but something you uncover, and that it already exists in the invisible realm, waiting to be manifested in the physical world. And the reason most people do not experience divine wealth is not because it is not available to them, but because they are unconsciously blocking its expression through their thoughts and words and beliefs about money and scarcity and limitation. Florence taught that every soul comes into this physical experience with what she called a divine inheritance. And this inheritance includes not just spiritual gifts, but also material abundance. But most people never claim their inheritance because they have been taught to believe that wealth must be earned through struggle and effort, and that if something comes easily, it must not be legitimate or sustainable. Maxine began to understand that she and Carl had been operating from what Florence called the consciousness of human wealth, which meant that they believed their security came from their jobs and their savings and their ability to work hard and plan carefully. And while these things are important in the physical world, they are not the ultimate source of security. And when you make them your ultimate source, then you become vulnerable to all the forces that can affect those external things. But Florence taught that there is another way to live, which is from the consciousness of divine wealth. And when you live from this consciousness, you understand that your ultimate security comes not from external things, but from your connection to the infinite source of all supply. And this connection can never be broken or threatened by external circumstances, because it exists in a realm that is beyond the reach of economic forces or human decisions. The practical application of this teaching, according to Florence, is learning to speak and think and feel as if you are already connected to unlimited abundance, rather than as if you are a victim of scarcity and limitation. And this is not about denying physical circumstances, but about aligning with a higher reality that has the power to transform physical circumstances. So Maxine began an experiment on January 3rd of 2009. She and Carl decided to start each day by speaking words that aligned them with divine wealth rather than human limitation. And the specific words they chose were these: "We are not unemployed, we are transitioning to our divine right work, and we are not broke. We are being redirected to our infinite supply, and we do not know how this will work out, but we know that it will work out because we are beloved children of an abundant universe." At first speaking, these words felt strange and even dishonest because their external circumstances had not changed, and they were still facing the same financial pressures and the same uncertainty about the future. But Florence had warned that there would be a gap between the inner work and the outer manifestation, and she had encouraged people to persist through this gap with faith, rather than giving up when immediate results were not visible. For the first 2 weeks, nothing seemed to change in their external circumstances. But Maxine noticed that something was shifting inside her. She was sleeping better at night and feeling less anxious during the day, and she found herself having ideas and inspirations that she had not had before, and she began to feel a sense of quiet confidence that everything was going to work out, even though she had no logical reason to feel that way. On January 19th, exactly 16 days after they had begun their daily practice of aligning with divine wealth, Maxine received a phone call that would change everything. The call was from a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, who ran a private practice for wealthy families in Columbus, which was about an hour drive from Marietta, and Dr. Morrison had gotten Maxine's name from another nurse who had recommended her, and she was looking for an experienced nurse who could work with elderly patients in their homes. Dr. Morrison explained that many of her patients were aging and needed assistance with medical care in their own homes rather than going to hospitals or nursing facilities. And she was looking for someone with Maxine's experience and skills and maturity, and she was willing to pay significantly more than Maxine had been earning at the hospital because the families she worked with valued quality care and were willing to pay for it. The position would require Maxine to travel to different homes throughout the week, but the pay was almost twice what she'd been making as a hospital nurse. And the work was more fulfilling because she would be building relationships with individual patients and families, rather than working in the impersonal environment of a hospital and doctor. Morrison said that if things worked out well, there would be opportunities for Maxine to eventually start her own private nursing practice, serving wealthy families throughout Central Ohio. But that was not the only surprise, because 3 days later, on January 22nd, Carl received an unexpected visit from a man named Robert Thompson, who owned a chain of hardware stores throughout Ohio, and had heard that Carl's store was closing, and he was interested in hiring Carl to manage one of his stores in a nearby town, and he was impressed with Carl's reputation for honesty and customer service and his knowledge of the hardware business. Mr. Thompson offered Carl a salary that was more than he had ever made as an owner of his own store, plus benefits and a retirement plan, and the opportunity to eventually become a partner in the business. And he said that he had been looking for someone exactly like Carl for over a year, and had been asking around until someone mentioned that Carl might be available within 3 weeks of beginning their practice of aligning with divine wealth instead of human limitation. Both Maxine and Carl had found employment that was better than what they had lost, and they were earning more money than they ever had before, and they were able to keep their home and begin rebuilding their financial security. But more importantly, they had discovered a way of living that was not dependent on external circumstances, but on their connection to a source of supply that could never be threatened or depleted. Maxine told me later that the most profound part of this experience was realizing that the financial crisis had not been a punishment or a tragedy, but a gift that had forced them to discover a way of accessing abundance that they never would have found if their old life had continued working. And she said that now, when she hears about people struggling with money, she wants to tell them that there is another way to live that most people do not know about, but that is available to anyone who is willing to learn the principles that Florence Scovel Shinn taught. The principle that Maxine and Carl demonstrated in their lives is what Florence called the alchemy of spiritual abundance. And this alchemy works by transforming the base metal of human consciousness, which is always focused on limitation and scarcity, and struggle into the gold of divine consciousness, which recognizes that abundance is the natural state of the universe, and that lack is only an illusion created by disconnection from our true source. Florence discovered that this alchemical transformation happens through the consistent use of words and thoughts and feelings that align with divine truth rather than human appearance. And she taught that when you speak as if you are already connected to infinite supply, rather than as if you are separate from supply, then you activate invisible forces that begin to rearrange your external circumstances to match your internal conviction. The reason this works, according to Florence, is that consciousness is the actual substance from which all physical forms are created. And when you change your consciousness, you literally change the materials from which your life experience is being constructed. And this is not metaphor, but actual spiritual science that operates according to precise laws and principles that are just as reliable as any physical law. But here is the most important part of this teaching. The fire of divine abundance that burns within you is not affected by external circumstances like job loss or economic crisis or aging or any of the other things that threaten human wealth. Because this fire burns on spiritual fuel, and spiritual fuel is unlimited and inexhaustible. And when you learn to tend this fire properly, it will provide you with everything you need, regardless of what is happening in the external world. While you sleep tonight, this fire is being tended by forces that operate beyond your conscious mind, and you do not need to worry about how this works or when you will see results, because the same intelligence that orchestrates the seasons and moves the planets is now orchestrating the circumstances of your life to bring you into alignment with your divine inheritance. And all you need to do is rest and receive and trust that what needs to happen is already happening in the invisible realm and will soon become visible in your physical experience. As you rest deeper into this space of receptivity and trust, I want to share with you what Florence Scovel Shinn considered to be the most important secret of divine abundance. And this secret is so simple that most people overlook it completely, and yet it is so powerful that understanding it can transform your entire relationship with money and wealth and prosperity in a matter of days or even hours. And this secret is that you do not attract what you want, but you attract what you are. And this means that if you want to experience abundance in your external world, you must first become abundant in your internal world. This principle goes against everything that most people have been taught about how wealth is created, because we live in a culture that teaches us to focus on doing and having rather than being, and so people spend their lives trying to do the right things and acquire the right things in order to become the right kind of person. But Florence discovered that this approach has the entire process backwards, and that the fastest way to change what you have is to first change who you are. Florence called this principle the law of identity, and she taught that your identity is like a magnet that attracts experiences and circumstances and people and opportunities that match the frequency of who you believe yourself to be. And if you believe yourself to be someone who struggles with money, then you will attract experiences of struggling with money. And if you believe yourself to be someone who is always broke, then you will attract experiences of being broke. But if you believe yourself to be someone who is naturally abundant, then you will attract experiences of abundance. The challenge for most people is that they have spent so many years identifying with limitation and scarcity that this identity feels true and real and unchangeable, and they cannot imagine being the kind of person who is naturally wealthy because they have so much evidence from their past that seems to prove that they are not that kind of person. And so they remain trapped in a cycle where their identity creates their experience and their experience reinforces their identity. But Florence discovered that identity is not fixed and unchangeable, but is actually fluid and moldable and can be transformed through the conscious and consistent use of spiritual principles. And she taught that the fastest way to change your identity is to begin speaking and thinking and feeling as if you are already the person you want to become, rather than continuing to speak and think and feel as if you are the person you think you are based on your past experiences. Let me tell you about Vernon, who was 65 years old when he learned about the law of identity and how applying this principle completely transformed his experience of abundance in ways that amazed everyone who knew him. Vernon lived in a suburb of Detroit, Michigan, and had worked for 42 years as a machinist in an automotive factory, and he had always been what people would call a working-class man who lived paycheck to paycheck and never seemed to get ahead, no matter how hard he worked or how carefully he budgeted his money. Vernon had grown up in a family where money was always scarce, and his parents had taught him that rich people were either lucky or dishonest, and that regular folks like them were meant to work hard and be grateful for whatever they could get. And Vernon had internalized these beliefs so deeply that he literally could not imagine himself as anything other than a working man who struggled to make ends meet. And he wore this identity like a uniform that defined not just how he saw himself, but how he moved through the world. When Vernon was 64, the automotive factory where he had worked for 4 decades announced that they were closing the plant and moving production to Mexico, and Vernon was offered an early retirement package that would provide him with a modest pension, but nowhere near enough money to maintain the lifestyle he and his wife Dorothy had been living. And at 64, Vernon felt too old to start over in a new career, but too young to live comfortably on a reduced income. Vernon's daughter Karen, who had moved to California and become interested in spiritual teachings, sent him a book about Florence Scovel Shinn and the law of identity. And when Vernon first read the book, he thought it was the most ridiculous thing he had ever encountered, because the idea that he could change his financial circumstances by changing his identity seemed completely absurd to a man who had spent his entire life believing that you are what you are, and that is that. But Karen was persistent, and she kept calling her father and talking to him about the principles in the book. And gradually Vernon began to understand that Florence was not talking about pretending to be someone you are not, but about remembering who you really are beneath all the layers of conditioning and limitation that you have accumulated over the years. And she was teaching that every soul comes into this world with a divine identity that includes unlimited access to abundance. But most people forget this divine identity and take on a human identity based on their circumstances and their family history and their cultural conditioning. Vernon began to realize that he had been identifying himself as a poor man, not because that was his true nature, but because that was what he had been taught to believe about himself, and he started to wonder what might happen if he experimented with identifying himself differently, even if it felt strange and uncomfortable at first. And so he decided to try what Florence called assuming the identity of abundance. The specific practice that Vernon began was very simple. Every morning when he woke up, and every evening before he went to sleep, he would speak these words out loud. I am a wealthy man, and money flows to me easily and naturally from multiple sources, and I am grateful for the abundance that is always available to me. And he would say these words with as much conviction as he could muster, even though they felt completely foreign to him. At first, Vernon also began to pay attention to the way he spoke about money throughout the day, and whenever he caught himself saying things like, I cannot afford that, or money is tight, or I am broke, he would immediately correct himself and say, instead, I choose not to purchase that right now, or I am redirecting my resources, or my abundance is reorganizing itself to serve my highest good. At first, this practice felt silly and even dishonest to Vernon, because his external circumstances had not changed, and he was still living on a limited pension and still worried about money. But Florence had taught that identity transformation happens from the inside out rather than from the outside in, and that you have to become the person internally before you can manifest the life externally. For the first month, Vernon noticed very little change in his external circumstances, but he did notice that he was feeling different about money. Instead of the constant anxiety and stress that he had carried for years, he began to feel a sense of calm confidence, as if he knew that everything was going to work out somehow, even though he had no logical reason to feel that way. And he found himself having ideas and inspirations about ways to generate income that had never occurred to him before. One of these ideas was to start a small business doing home repairs and maintenance for elderly neighbors who could no longer do these tasks themselves. Vernon had always been skilled with his hands and had enjoyed working on his own home, but it had never occurred to him that these skills could be a source of income. And as he began to identify himself as a wealthy man rather than a poor man, he started to see opportunities that had been invisible to him when he was trapped in his old identity. Vernon started his business very modestly by offering to help a neighbor fix a leaky faucet, and when word got around that he did good work at reasonable prices, he began to get more requests, and within 6 months, he was earning almost as much from his small business as he had been receiving from his pension, and he was enjoying the work much more than he had ever enjoyed working in the factory. But the real breakthrough came when Vernon was approached by a local real estate investor named Michael, who had heard about Vernon's work and was looking for someone to manage the maintenance and renovation of rental properties that he owned throughout the Detroit area. Michael offered Vernon a partnership where Vernon would oversee the work and receive a percentage of the rental income from the properties in addition to payment for the actual maintenance work. This partnership opportunity would provide Vernon with a steady income that was significantly higher than what he had been earning at the factory, plus the potential for that income to grow over time as Michael acquired more properties. and Vernon realized that this opportunity had come to him not because he had been looking for it, but because he had changed his identity from someone who worked for other people to someone who created value and abundance through his own skills and initiative. Within 18 months of beginning his practice of assuming the identity of abundance, Vernon had gone from being a retired factory worker living on a modest pension to being a successful business owner and partner in a growing real estate enterprise, and his income had tripled. And more importantly, he had discovered talents and abilities that he never knew he had because they had been hidden beneath his old identity as a working-class man who could only earn money through hard physical labor. Vernon told me that the most shocking part of this transformation was realizing that the opportunities had probably been available to him all along, but he had been unable to see them because his identity as a poor man had created a kind of blindness that prevented him from recognizing possibilities that did not match his self-image. And he said that changing his identity was like putting on a new pair of glasses that allowed him to see a completely different world. The principle that Vernon demonstrated in his life is what Florence called the magnetic power of identity. And she taught that your identity functions like a radio transmitter that broadcasts a specific frequency into the invisible realm, and the universe responds to that frequency by sending you experiences and opportunities and people that match the signal you are broadcasting. When Vernon was identifying himself as a poor man, he was broadcasting the frequency of limitation and struggle. And so the universe sent him experiences of limitation and struggle. But when he began identifying himself as a wealthy man, he started broadcasting the frequency of abundance and creativity. And so the universe began sending him experiences of abundance and creativity. Florence discovered that this principle works because identity is not just a mental concept, but an actual energetic reality that affects the field of consciousness around you. And when you change your identity, you literally change the field of possibility that surrounds you. And this change in the field attracts different circumstances and opportunities into your life. But here is what makes this principle so powerful and also so challenging for most people to apply. Your identity is not determined by your past experiences or your current circumstances, but by who you choose to be in this moment right now. And this means that you can begin identifying yourself as a wealthy person immediately, regardless of how much money you currently have in your bank account. Florence taught that the wealthy soul is not someone who has accumulated a certain amount of money, but someone who recognizes their divine right to abundance and lives from that recognition rather than from the fear of scarcity. And this recognition is not dependent on external circumstances, but on internal conviction. And this conviction can be developed through the consistent practice of thinking and speaking and feeling as if you are already the person you are becoming. The identity of the wealthy soul, according to Florence, includes several key characteristics. First, wealthy souls know that they are not separate from the source of abundance, but are actually expressions of that source. And therefore they do not need to chase after money because they understand that they are the place where money naturally wants to express itself. Second, wealthy souls are not attached to specific outcomes or timelines because they trust that the universe is always orchestrating circumstances to bring them into alignment with their highest good. And they remain open and receptive to opportunities that may look different from what they expected, but that serve their ultimate purpose. Third, wealthy souls are generous and grateful because they understand that wealth is meant to flow rather than to be hoarded. And they know that the more they share their abundance, the more abundance they attract, because giving and receiving are two aspects of the same divine principle. Fourth, wealthy souls do not identify with temporary financial setbacks or challenges because they know that these are just appearances in the physical world and do not affect their true identity as beloved children of an abundant universe, and they use these challenges as opportunities to deepen their faith and strengthen their connection to divine supply. As you rest tonight, these characteristics of the wealthy soul are being activated within your consciousness, and you do not need to force this process or worry about whether you are doing it correctly, because your subconscious mind knows exactly how to integrate these new patterns of identity. And tomorrow, you will begin to notice that you are naturally thinking and speaking and feeling differently about money and abundance, and this new identity will begin to attract new experiences that match the person you are becoming rather than the person you used to be. As you continue to rest in this space of deep receptivity, I want to address something that Florence Scovel Shinn encountered again and again in her work with people who were learning to access divine abundance. And this something was so common and so persistent that she came to consider it one of the greatest obstacles to manifesting wealth and prosperity. And yet, it was also one of the most surprising obstacles because it was not what most people would expect. And this obstacle was not the inability to give or to work hard or to be deserving, but rather the inability to receive. Florence discovered that most people have a much easier time giving than receiving, and that many people who consider themselves generous and loving actually have deep unconscious resistance to allowing good things to come into their lives. And this resistance operates below the level of conscious awareness, which means that people can sincerely want abundance and can work very hard to create abundance and can even speak all the right words about abundance, but still block the very abundance they are trying to attract because some part of them does not believe they deserve it or does not feel safe having it. This resistance to receiving can take many different forms, and Florence identified 7 primary patterns that she saw repeatedly in her clients and students, and these patterns are so subtle and so deeply ingrained that most people do not even realize they are operating, and yet they are powerful enough to block the flow of divine abundance, no matter how much spiritual work a person is doing or how aligned they think they are with prosperity consciousness. The first pattern of resistance is what Florence called the unworthiness trap. And this is the belief that you must earn abundance through suffering or struggle or proving yourself worthy. And people caught in this pattern feel guilty about receiving good things easily, and they unconsciously sabotage opportunities that come without effort because they believe that anything worthwhile must be difficult. The second pattern is the safety trap, which is the fear that having abundance will make you a target for criticism or jealousy or attack. And people caught in this pattern prefer to remain small and invisible rather than risk the vulnerability that comes with being prosperous and successful, and they convince themselves that they are more spiritual or more humble by choosing lack over abundance. The third pattern is the identity trap, which is the attachment to being someone who struggles or who is a victim of circumstances, and people caught in this pattern derive their sense of self and their connection to others from their problems and their limitations. And they fear that if they become abundant, they will lose their identity and their place in their family or community. The fourth pattern is the control trap, which is the need to understand exactly how abundance will manifest and to control every aspect of the process. And people caught in this pattern cannot surrender to divine timing or divine methods, and they block abundance because they are only willing to receive it in the specific ways they think it should come. The fifth pattern is the separation trap, which is the belief that receiving abundance takes something away from someone else, and people caught in this pattern feel guilty about having more than others, and they unconsciously limit their own prosperity because they think it is selfish or unfair to have abundance while others are struggling. The sixth pattern is the past trap, which is the conviction that because abundance has not manifested in the past, it cannot manifest in the future. And people caught in this pattern use their history of lack as evidence that they are not meant to be abundant, and they create self-fulfilling prophecies by expecting the future to repeat the past. The seventh pattern is the perfection trap, which is the belief that you must be spiritually perfect or emotionally healed or completely positive before you can receive abundance, and people caught in this pattern postpone their good indefinitely while they work on becoming worthy, and they use their imperfections as excuses to remain in limitation. Let me tell you about Lorraine, who was 59 years old when she discovered that she had been operating from several of these resistance patterns simultaneously without even realizing it. And her story will show you how subtle and pervasive these blocks can be, and also how quickly they can be dissolved. Once they are brought into conscious awareness, Lorraine lived in Portland, Oregon, and had been studying spiritual principles and prosperity consciousness for over 15 years, and she could speak eloquently about abundance and manifestation and the law of attraction, and she meditated daily and did affirmations and visualizations and attended workshops and read every book she could find about creating wealth. And yet, despite all of this spiritual work, her financial situation remained essentially unchanged. Year after year, Lorraine worked as a massage therapist and energy healer, and she was very good at her work and had many clients who loved her and referred others to her. But somehow, she could never seem to charge what her services were worth or attract enough clients to feel financially secure, and she lived in a constant state of mild financial stress that never quite became a crisis, but never resolved into true abundance either. For years, Lorraine assumed that her lack of financial success was due to external factors like the economy or competition from other healers, or the fact that people did not value alternative healing enough to pay premium prices for it. And she would often say things like, "People just do not want to invest in their healing," or "The world is not ready for the kind of work I do," or "I am not meant to be wealthy because I am here to serve, not to make money." But in the spring of 2012, when Lorraine was 58, she attended a workshop about Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings, and during one of the exercises, she was asked to examine her unconscious beliefs about receiving abundance, and what she discovered shocked her, because she realized that despite all her conscious work on prosperity consciousness, she had been unconsciously sabotaging her own abundance in multiple ways. The first thing Lorraine noticed was that she had a deep-seated belief that spiritual people should not be concerned with money, and that charging high prices for healing work was somehow unspiritual or greedy. And she realized that this belief had caused her to consistently undercharge for her services and to feel guilty whenever she tried to raise her prices, even though her clients often told her that her work was worth much more than what she charged. The second thing she noticed was that she was terrified of being judged or criticized by her family and friends who came from working-class backgrounds and had always been suspicious of people who had more money than they did. And Lorraine realized that she had been keeping herself small financially in order to maintain her relationships and avoid the discomfort of being different from the people she loved. The third thing she noticed was that she had been using her financial struggles as a way to connect with other people who were also struggling, and that in some unconscious way, she was attached to being someone who understood what it was like to worry about money. And she realized that if she became truly abundant, she might lose that connection and feel isolated or alienated from others. The fourth thing she noticed was that she had been trying to control exactly how abundance would come to her, and that she was only open to receiving money through her healing practice and had been unconsciously blocking other potential sources of income because they did not fit her image of how a spiritual person should make money. Once Lorraine became aware of these resistance patterns, she understood why all of her conscious work on abundance had not produced the results she wanted, because she had been working against herself, trying to attract abundance with her conscious mind, while simultaneously repelling it with her unconscious beliefs and fears and resistances. Florence had taught that the way to dissolve resistance to receiving is not to fight against it or to judge yourself for having it, but rather to acknowledge it with compassion and then to gradually retrain your unconscious mind to feel safe and worthy of abundance. And the specific method Florence recommended was what she called the practice of receiving readiness. This practice involves 3 steps. First, you identify the specific ways you resist receiving abundance, and you acknowledge these patterns without judgment as natural protective mechanisms that developed for good reasons, but that are no longer serving you. Second, you begin to speak words and think thoughts that train your subconscious mind to feel safe about receiving abundance. And third, you practice receiving in small ways so that your nervous system can gradually adjust to the experience of being abundant. Lorraine decided to apply this practice systematically to each of the resistance patterns she had identified, and she began by addressing her belief that spiritual people should not be concerned with money. And she started speaking these words every morning. I am a spiritual being having a physical experience, and money is spiritual energy that allows me to serve at my highest level, and the more abundance I receive, the more I can give to others. To address her fear of being judged by her family and friends, she began saying these words: "My prosperity inspires others to claim their own abundance, and my success gives other people permission to succeed, and I can be wealthy and still be loving and generous and connected to the people I care about." To address her attachment to struggling, she began saying these words: "I release the identity of someone who worries about money, and I embrace the identity of someone who trusts in divine supply, and I can be prosperous and still be compassionate toward others who are struggling." To address her need to control how abundance manifested, she began saying these words: "I am open to receiving abundance from expected and unexpected sources in expected and unexpected ways. And I trust that divine intelligence knows better than I do how to bring me everything I need." The results of this practice were remarkable and began to show up much more quickly than Lorraine had expected, because within 2 weeks of beginning to dissolve her resistance patterns, she received a phone call from a client who wanted to book 12 sessions in advance and was willing to pay double her normal rate for the convenience of having her time reserved. Then the following month, she was invited to teach at a wellness retreat center that would pay her more for one weekend than she normally made in a month. And the month after that, she was approached by a publisher who wanted to hire her to write articles about energy healing for a national magazine that would provide her with both income and exposure to thousands of potential clients. But the most significant change was not in her external circumstances, but in her internal experience of abundance. Because for the first time in her adult life, Lorraine felt genuinely excited about money rather than anxious about it. And she began to see financial opportunities everywhere, whereas before she had been blind to them. And she realized that the opportunities had probably been there all along, but she had not been able to see them because her resistance had created a kind of perceptual filter that blocked abundance from her awareness. Within 6 months of beginning her practice of dissolving resistance to receiving, Lorraine had tripled her income. And more importantly, she had discovered that abundance was not something she had to chase or work hard to create, but something that was naturally flowing toward her all the time. And all she had to do was remove the blocks that were preventing her from receiving it. Lorraine told me later that the most profound part of this transformation was realizing that her resistance to receiving had not been protecting her as she had unconsciously believed, but had actually been keeping her from fulfilling her purpose. Because when she finally allowed herself to receive the abundance that was meant for her, she was able to serve many more people and make a much greater impact in the world. The principle that Lorraine demonstrated in her life is what Florence called the law of receptivity. And this law states that your capacity to receive abundance is determined not by external circumstances, but by your internal willingness to allow abundance into your life. And this willingness is not something you either have or do not have, but something that can be developed through conscious practice and patience with yourself. Florence discovered that resistance to receiving is almost always based on outdated beliefs and fears that were formed earlier in life, when they may have served a protective function, but that are no longer necessary or helpful. And she taught that these beliefs and fears can be dissolved through the gentle and consistent application of spiritual truth, rather than through force or self-criticism. The most important thing to understand about resistance to receiving, according to Florence, is that it is not a character flaw or a spiritual failing, but a natural human tendency that can be transformed through awareness and practice. And she emphasized that everyone has some degree of resistance to receiving, and that acknowledging this resistance is the first step toward dissolving it. Florence also taught that resistance to receiving often increases just before a major breakthrough in abundance, because the ego mind senses that change is coming and tries to maintain the familiar patterns, even if those patterns are painful. And she encouraged her students to persist through periods of increased resistance, because they often signal that manifestation is imminent. While you sleep tonight, any resistance you may have to receiving abundance is being gently dissolved by the wisdom of your subconscious mind, and you do not need to identify or analyze or fight against this resistance, because your inner guidance knows exactly how to release whatever is no longer serving you. And tomorrow you will. Find yourself naturally more open and receptive to the abundance that is always flowing toward you. As you rest even deeper into this space of trust and receptivity, I want to share with you one of the most encouraging aspects of Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings. And this is her understanding that divine abundance never manifests suddenly or without warning, but always announces itself through what she called signs and signals that begin to appear in your experience long before the actual manifestation occurs in the physical world. Florence discovered that learning to recognize these signs is crucial because they serve multiple important purposes. First, they provide confirmation that your spiritual work is having an effect even when you cannot yet see tangible results. Second, they help you maintain faith and persistence during the period between planting the seed and harvesting the crop. And third, they guide you toward the specific actions and opportunities that will allow the abundance to manifest in the most perfect way. Most people miss these signs entirely because they are looking for dramatic immediate changes, and they overlook the subtle but significant shifts that always precede major manifestations. And Florence taught that developing the ability to read these signs is like learning a new language, the language of divine communication. And once you become fluent in this language, you will never again feel confused or uncertain about whether your manifestations are working, because you will always know exactly where you are in the process. Florence identified 3 distinct phases of signs that appear as divine abundance begins to manifest, and she taught that understanding these phases can help you navigate the manifestation process with confidence and patience rather than anxiety and doubt. And these phases are what she called the awakening phase, the acceleration phase, and the manifestation phase. The awakening phase is characterized by internal changes that occur in your thoughts and feelings and energy before any external changes are visible. And during this phase, you begin to feel different about money and abundance, even though your circumstances have not yet changed. And you may notice that you are less anxious about financial matters, or that you are having new ideas and inspirations, or that you are feeling more optimistic about the future for no logical reason. The acceleration phase is characterized by what Florence called synchronicities and small manifestations that indicate the invisible forces are beginning to rearrange your external circumstances. And during this phase, you may notice meaningful coincidences or unexpected opportunities or small amounts of money coming from unexpected sources or people mentioning things that are directly related to your desires. The manifestation phase is when the abundance actually appears in your physical experience in a form that you can see and measure and count. And this phase often happens more quickly than people expect once the first 2 phases have been completed. Because by the time you reach the manifestation phase, all of the invisible work has already been done, and the physical appearance is simply the final step in a process that has been unfolding for weeks or months. Let me tell you about Clifford, who was 56 years old when he learned to recognize these signs, and how this knowledge completely transformed his experience of manifesting abundance from one of confusion and frustration to one of clarity and confidence, and his story will show you exactly what to look for as the fire of divine wealth begins to awaken within your own life. Clifford lived in Salt Lake City, Utah, and worked as an accountant for a mid-sized construction company, and he had been married to his wife Susan for 28 years, and they had raised 3 children who were now adults and living on their own. And Clifford had always been a careful and conservative man who believed in working hard and saving money and planning for the future, but despite his responsible approach to finances, he and Susan were struggling to build the retirement savings they needed and were worried about their financial security as they entered their 60s. In 2014, when Clifford was 55, he attended a seminar about wealth building where he first heard about Florence Scovel Shinn and her teachings about divine abundance. And at first, Clifford was skeptical because the ideas seemed too good to be true and too different from everything he had been taught about money. But something about the teachings resonated with him, and he decided to experiment with applying the principles. Clifford began by working on changing his identity from someone who struggled to accumulate wealth to someone who was naturally abundant, and he started speaking daily affirmations about being a magnet for prosperity. And he began to visualize himself as financially free, and he made an effort to feel grateful for the abundance he already had, rather than focusing on what he lacked. For the first month, Clifford did not see any changes in his external circumstances, and he began to wonder if the teachings were actually effective or if he was wasting his time. But then he started to notice subtle shifts in his internal experience that he had not expected, and these shifts were so gradual that he almost missed them entirely. The first thing Clifford noticed was that he was sleeping better at night and feeling less anxious during the day about money matters, and he realized that for years he had been carrying a constant low-level stress about finances that he had not even been fully aware of, but that had been affecting his mood and his energy and his health, and now that stress was beginning to lift, even though his financial situation had not yet changed. The second thing he noticed was that he was having ideas about additional sources of income that had never occurred to him before. And these ideas seemed to come out of nowhere during moments when he was relaxed and not thinking about money. And he found himself considering possibilities like freelance bookkeeping or real estate investing or starting a small business that he had never seriously contemplated. The third thing he noticed was that he was feeling more confident and optimistic about the future. And when Susan would worry about their retirement savings, Clifford found himself reassuring her that everything would work out even though he had no logical reason to feel so certain, and this confidence was not based on anything he could point to in their external circumstances, but seemed to be coming from some deeper place of knowing. After about 6 weeks of daily spiritual practice, Clifford began to notice what he later recognized as signs of the acceleration phase, and these signs were small at first, but they were unmistakably different from anything that had been happening in his life before he started working with the abundance principles. The first sign was that Clifford received an unexpected tax refund of $837 due to an error in his previous year's return that had been discovered during an audit of his employer's books. And while $837 was not a life-changing amount of money, it represented the first time in years that Clifford had received money that he had not been expecting. The second sign was that Susan mentioned to him that her sister, Carol, who lived in Phoenix, had suggested that Clifford might be interested in doing some consulting work for Carol's husband, who owned a small trucking company and needed help organizing his financial records. And Susan had not thought to mention this earlier because she had not realized that Clifford might be interested in taking on additional work. The third sign was that Clifford overheard a conversation at work between two colleagues who were talking about a real estate investment opportunity. And one of them mentioned that they were looking for a third partner who could help with the financial analysis. And Clifford found himself thinking that he had exactly the skills they were looking for, even though he had never considered himself qualified for real estate investing before. These signs might have seemed like coincidences to someone who was not aware of the manifestation process, but Clifford recognized them as evidence that the invisible forces were beginning to respond to his new consciousness about abundance, and he decided to follow up on each of these opportunities rather than dismissing them as he might have done in the past. When Clifford contacted Carol's husband about the consulting work, he discovered that the project was larger and more lucrative than he had expected and would involve helping to reorganize the financial systems for the entire trucking company, which could provide Clifford with enough additional income to significantly accelerate his retirement. Savings. When Clifford approached his colleagues about the real estate investment, he learned that they had been looking for someone with his exact background for several months, and that the investment opportunity was a commercial property that was being sold below market value due to the owner's need for a quick sale, and Clifford's analysis showed that the investment could provide substantial returns with relatively low risk. Within 4 months of beginning his abundance practice, Clifford had manifested 2 new sources of income that together would more than double his annual earnings. And more importantly, these opportunities had come to him through synchronicities and connections, rather than through his own effort or searching, and he realized that he had entered what Florence called the manifestation phase. But the most remarkable part of Clifford's story was not the financial results, but the way his experience of the entire process had unfolded, because he had been able to recognize the signs along the way and understand that each phase was preparing him for the next phase. And this understanding had allowed him to maintain faith and take appropriate action rather than giving up or becoming discouraged. Clifford told me that before learning about the signs of manifestation, he had tried various approaches to building wealth, but had always given up when he did not see immediate results, and he had assumed that he was not meant to be wealthy or that the strategies did not work. But now he understood that manifestation is a process that unfolds over time, and that the signs are there to guide you if you know how to read them. The principle that Clifford demonstrated in his life is what Florence called the language of divine supply, and she taught that the universe is constantly communicating with us through signs and synchronicities and opportunities. But most people are not fluent in this language, and so they miss the guidance that is being offered to them. Florence discovered that the signs of awakening abundance follow predictable patterns, and that learning to recognize these patterns can dramatically accelerate your manifestation process. Because when you know what to look for, you can cooperate with the process rather than working against it. The first category of signs, according to Florence, is internal shifts in your thoughts and feelings and energy. And these signs include feeling more peaceful about money, matters, having new ideas and inspirations, feeling more optimistic about the future, experiencing increased confidence and self-worth, and noticing that you are naturally thinking different thoughts about abundance. The second category of signs is what Florence called external synchronicities, and these include meaningful coincidences related to your desires, unexpected opportunities that match your goals, small manifestations that seem to come out of nowhere, people mentioning things that are directly related to what you want, and finding yourself in the right place at the right time with increasing frequency. The third category of signs is what Florence called preparation signs, and these include opportunities to develop new skills that will be needed for your manifestation, doors opening in areas that had previously been closed, invitations to participate in activities or groups that are aligned with your goals, and a general sense that the universe is preparing you for something bigger. Florence taught that the key to working with these signs is to pay attention to them without becoming attached to them, and to follow up on the opportunities they present without forcing or pushing, but rather with a sense of playful curiosity and trust that everything is unfolding in perfect divine order. She also emphasized that the signs will continue to appear throughout the manifestation process, and that each sign builds upon the previous ones, creating a momentum that eventually becomes unstoppable. And she encouraged her students to keep a journal of the signs they noticed so that they could see the patterns and track their progress. While you sleep tonight, the signs of your own abundance manifestation are already being prepared in the invisible realm, and you do not need to look for them or worry about recognizing them, because they will be unmistakable when they appear, and your inner guidance will help you understand their meaning and know how to respond to them. And tomorrow, you may begin to notice the first gentle signs that the fire of divine wealth is awakening within the water of your consciousness. As you continue to rest in this deepening state of receptivity, I want to share with you one of the most challenging yet liberating aspects of Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings about divine abundance, and this aspect has to do with what she called divine timing, and the understanding that manifestation operates according to a timeline that is often very different from human expectations, and yet is always perfectly aligned with your highest good and greatest benefit. Florence discovered through her own experience and through working with hundreds of clients that there is a divine intelligence that orchestrates the timing of manifestations. And this intelligence takes into account factors that are completely invisible to human perception, such as the readiness of all the people involved, the preparation of circumstances that must be in place, the alignment of opportunities that must converge, and the spiritual growth that must occur before the manifestation can serve its highest purpose. This understanding of divine timing was revolutionary because it freed people from the anxiety and frustration that comes from trying to force manifestations to happen according to human schedules and human logic, and it allowed them to relax into a state of trust and patience, knowing that their good was not delayed or denied, but was being perfectly orchestrated to arrive at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way. But Florence also understood that trusting divine timing is one of the most difficult things for people to do, especially when they are facing urgent financial needs or when they have been waiting for abundance to manifest for what seems like a very long time. And she developed specific teachings to help people navigate the waiting period with faith rather than fear, and with gratitude rather than impatience. Florence taught that divine timing operates according to what she called the principle of perfect preparation. And this principle states that manifestations do not occur until all the elements necessary for their success have been perfectly arranged. And this arrangement happens not only in the external world, but also in the internal world of consciousness and spiritual readiness. She explained that when you plant a seed in the ground, you do not expect it to become a full-grown plant overnight, because you understand that there is a natural process of germination and growth that must unfold before the plant can bear fruit, and she taught that manifestations work according to the same principle. There is always a period of invisible development that must be completed before the manifestation can appear in the physical world. Florence also discovered that divine timing often appears to human perception as delay or obstacle when it is actually protection and preparation. And she gave many examples of people who thought their manifestations were being blocked when they were actually being guided away from opportunities that would not have served their highest good and toward opportunities that were far better than anything they could have imagined. Let me tell you about Marlene, who was 63 years old when she learned to trust divine timing in a way that completely transformed her relationship with manifestation, from one of anxiety and control to one of patience and surrender. And her story will show you how divine timing always works for your benefit, even when it appears to be working against you. Marlene lived in Tucson, Arizona, and had been divorced for 8 years after a 32-year marriage that had ended when her husband left her for a younger woman. And the divorce settlement had given Marlene the house and half of their retirement savings, but not enough to maintain her previous lifestyle, and certainly not enough to feel secure about her future, especially since she was 55 at the time and had not worked outside the home for most of her adult life. For several years after the divorce, Marlene struggled both emotionally and financially, and she took a part-time job at a local bookstore that she enjoyed, but that paid very little, and she gradually depleted her savings, trying to maintain the house and cover her basic expenses. And by the time she was 62, she was facing the very real possibility of having to sell the house and move into a small apartment, which felt like a devastating final blow to the life she had worked so hard to build. It was during this dark period that Marlene discovered Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings through a book that someone had left behind at the bookstore. And as she read about divine abundance and perfect provision, she began to hope that maybe there was a way out of her financial difficulties that she had not yet considered, and she decided to apply the principles with complete dedication and see what would happen. Marlene began her abundance practice in January of 2015 when she was 62, and she started by working on changing her identity from someone who was a victim of her ex-husband's betrayal to someone who was being prepared for something wonderful that she could not yet see. And she began speaking words of gratitude for the abundance that was coming to her, even though she had no evidence of this abundance in her external circumstances. For the first 6 months, Marlene was very diligent about her spiritual practice, and she noticed many of the internal signs that indicated her consciousness was shifting, but she did not see any external changes in her financial situation. And she began to worry that maybe she was too old for the principles to work, or maybe her situation was too difficult to be resolved through spiritual means. By July of 2015, Marlene was becoming increasingly anxious because her savings were almost depleted, and she had received a notice from the bank about missed mortgage payments, and she was facing the very real possibility of foreclosure within 90 days. And she found herself wondering if she had been foolish to trust in divine timing when she should have been taking more practical action to solve her problems. It was during this period of maximum stress that Marlene had what she later described as a spiritual crisis, where she had to choose between abandoning her faith in divine provision and surrendering even more deeply to the process. And she told me later that this choice felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and having to decide whether to jump or turn back. And she realized that turning back would mean giving up on everything she had been working toward. On August 15, 2015, at exactly 3:47 in the afternoon, Marlene made a decision that would change everything. She got down on her knees in her living room and spoke these words out loud. "I do not understand your timing, divine intelligence, but I trust that you know what you are doing, and I surrender my fears and my need to control this situation, and I ask only that you use me as an instrument of your perfect plan, whatever that plan may be." 3 days later, on August 18th, Marlene received a phone call that seemed to come out of nowhere. The call was from an attorney named David Richardson, who represented the estate of a woman named Eleanor Hamilton, who had died 6 months earlier. And Mr. Richardson explained that he had been trying to locate Marlene for several weeks because Eleanor had left her a substantial inheritance in her will. Marlene was shocked because she had never heard of Eleanor Hamilton and had no idea why this woman would have left her anything. And Mr. Richardson explained that Eleanor had been a customer at the bookstore where Marlene worked and had apparently been so impressed by Marlene's kindness and intelligence during their conversations about books and life that she had decided to include her in her will, along with several other people who had made a positive impact on her life. The inheritance was for $97,000, which was exactly enough to pay off Marlene's mortgage and provide her with a comfortable cushion for the future. And Mr. Richardson explained that the delay in contacting her had been due to the complexity of the estate and the time required to locate all of the beneficiaries and to complete the legal paperwork required for such a large distribution. But that was not the end of the story, because 2 weeks later, Marlene received another unexpected phone call, this time from a woman named Janet Morrison, who owned a small publishing company that specialized in books about personal development and spirituality. And Janet explained that she had heard about Marlene's story from David Richardson, who was also her attorney, and she was wondering if Marlene would be interested in writing a book about her experience with divine timing and manifestation. Janet offered Marlene an advance of $15,000 to write the book, plus royalties on all sales. And she also offered to help Marlene develop a speaking career around the themes of the book. And she said that there was a growing market for authentic stories about spiritual transformation, especially from women who had overcome significant challenges later in life. Within 6 weeks of her moment of complete surrender, Marlene had gone from facing foreclosure to being financially secure for the rest of her life, and from feeling like her life was over to having an exciting new career as an author and speaker. And when I interviewed Marlene 2 years later, she told me that the most amazing part of the experience was realizing that every apparent delay and obstacle had actually been necessary preparation for the perfect outcome. Marlene explained that if the inheritance had come earlier, she would not have been desperate enough to truly surrender her need for control, and she would not have been ready to receive such a large amount of money with the proper gratitude and consciousness. And she also realized that if Janet had approached her about writing a book before she had lived through the experience of divine timing, she would not have had an authentic story to tell. She also discovered that Eleanor Hamilton had been watching her at the bookstore for over 2 years and had been planning to include her in her will long before Marlene even knew about abundance principles. And this meant that her provision had been in preparation for longer than she had been consciously working to manifest it. And she realized that divine intelligence had been orchestrating her good even when she was not aware of it. The principle that Marlene demonstrated in her life is what Florence called the law of divine timing. And this law states that every manifestation arrives at the perfect moment when all elements are aligned for maximum benefit and minimum resistance. And that what appears to human perception as delay is actually divine preparation, ensuring that when your good arrives, you are ready to receive it and use it wisely. Florence discovered that divine timing operates according to several key principles that are very different from human timing. First divine timing considers the readiness of all parties involved, not just the person who is doing the manifesting. And sometimes a delay occurs because other people need time to be prepared for their role in your manifestation. Second divine timing considers the spiritual lessons that must be learned before the manifestation can serve its highest purpose. And sometimes what feels like a delay is actually an accelerated course in faith or patience or surrender that is preparing you to handle greater abundance with wisdom and grace. Third divine timing considers factors in the external world that must align before the manifestation can occur successfully. And sometimes a delay is protecting you from receiving your good at a time when external circumstances would prevent you from fully enjoying or benefiting from it. Fourth divine timing considers your own internal readiness to receive and steward whatever you are manifesting. And sometimes a delay occurs because your consciousness must expand or your character must develop before you can be trusted with greater abundance. Florence taught that the key to working with divine timing is to focus on your internal development and trust, rather than trying to control external circumstances and timelines. And she emphasized that every moment of waiting is actually a moment of preparation, and that nothing is ever truly delayed in the divine plan, but only perfectly timed. She also taught that the period of waiting before manifestation is not passive, but active, and that during this time you are called to deepen your faith, practice gratitude, cultivate patience, and continue to align your consciousness with abundance rather than with lack. And these spiritual activities actually accelerate the manifestation process by preparing you to be a clear channel for divine abundance. While you sleep tonight, divine timing is operating in your life to orchestrate circumstances that will bring you the perfect provision at the perfect moment, and you do not need to worry about when this will happen or how it will unfold, because the same intelligence that moves the planets and changes the seasons is now arranging every detail of your manifestation with precision that surpasses human understanding. As you rest in this sacred space of deep receptivity, I want to share with you one of Florence Scovel Shinn's most profound discoveries about the nature of abundance. And this discovery was that individual manifestation is not separate from collective manifestation, but that every person who successfully accesses divine wealth strengthens what she called the field of abundance for everyone else and creates easier pathways for others to follow. Florence understood that consciousness is not individual, but collective, and that when one person breaks through limiting beliefs about money and learns to receive divine abundance, it creates what she called a track in consciousness that makes it easier for the next person to access the same abundance. And she taught that this is why spiritual communities and mastermind groups can be so powerful for manifestation, because they create concentrated fields of possibility that support everyone within the group. This understanding of the collective field of abundance was revolutionary, because it meant that manifesting wealth was not a selfish or competitive activity, but was actually a service to humanity, because every person who stepped into their full abundance made it easier for others to do the same. And Florence encouraged her students to think of themselves not as individuals trying to get something for themselves, but as pioneers clearing pathways for others to follow. Florence also discovered that the collective field works both ways, and that just as your success contributes to the success of others, your willingness to receive abundance helps to heal the collective wounds around money and scarcity that have been passed down through generations and cultures. And she taught that choosing abundance over lack is actually a form of spiritual activism that helps to transform the consciousness of the entire planet. But perhaps most importantly, Florence found that understanding the collective field eliminates the guilt and fear that many people feel about becoming abundant, because they realize that their wealth does not take anything away from anyone else, but actually creates more abundance for everyone. And she taught that hoarding resources is what creates scarcity, while circulating resources is what creates abundance. Let me tell you about Wesley, who was 68 years old when he discovered the power of the collective field of abundance. and how his understanding of this principle not only transformed his own financial situation, but also created a ripple effect that touched the lives of dozens of other people in ways that he never could have imagined. Wesley lived in Charleston, South Carolina, and had been a high school teacher for 41 years until he retired at the age of 67. And although he loved teaching and felt that he had made a difference in the lives of many students, he had never been able to accumulate significant wealth on a teacher's salary, and his retirement income was modest and forced him to live very carefully. Wesley had always been interested in personal development and spiritual growth, and he had read many books about success and abundance over the years, but none of the techniques he tried had produced significant results in his financial life, and he had begun to believe that maybe he was just not meant to be wealthy, and that he should be grateful for what he had and stop wanting more. In the spring of 2016, when Wesley was 68, he attended a workshop about Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings, and during the workshop, he learned about the collective field of abundance and the idea that his success would contribute to the success of others, and this concept completely changed his motivation for pursuing abundance, because he realized that it was not about him getting something for himself, but about him serving something larger than himself. Wesley decided to approach abundance from this new perspective of service rather than acquisition, and he began his practice by setting an intention not just to manifest wealth for himself, but to become what he called a beacon of possibility that would inspire and encourage others who were struggling with financial limitations. And he started speaking these words every morning: "I am not manifesting abundance for myself alone, but for all those who will be inspired by my success." The first thing Wesley did was to start a small group at his local library where people could come together to study abundance principles and support each other in their manifestation practices. And he called the group the Abundance Circle. And he made it clear that the purpose was not just individual success, but collective transformation. And he was amazed. When 23 people showed up for the first meeting, Wesley structured the meetings around the principle of collective witness, where each person would share their abundance goals and challenges, and the group would hold space for those manifestations while also sharing resources and opportunities and connections that might help each member. And he emphasized that everyone's success contributed to everyone else's success. Within 3 months, the Abundance Circle had grown to over 40 people. And Wesley began to notice that manifestations were happening much more quickly for group members than they typically did for people working alone. And he realized that they had created a concentrated field of possibility that was accelerating everyone's results. But the most remarkable thing was what began happening in Wesley's own life. Because as he focused on serving the abundance of others, his own financial situation began to transform in ways that he had never experienced before. And these changes started small but grew exponentially as his commitment to the collective field deepened. The first manifestation was that Wesley was approached by the principal of his former school, who asked if he would be interested in tutoring students who were struggling with mathematics, and the principal offered to pay Wesley significantly more per hour than he had earned as a full-time teacher, and the work would be part-time and flexible and would allow him to maintain his other activities. Then one of the members of the Abundance Circle, who owned a small real estate company, asked Wesley if he would be interested in helping with bookkeeping and property management, and this opportunity provided Wesley with another stream of income that required skills he already had but had never thought to monetize. But the breakthrough came when Wesley was invited to speak at a regional conference about creating abundance in retirement, and his presentation was so well received that he began to get requests to speak at other events and workshops, and within 6 months, he had developed a new career as a speaker and consultant, helping retirees discover new sources of income and purpose. What made Wesley's transformation even more remarkable was that each success he experienced seemed to create success for others in the Abundance Circle. And as his speaking career developed, he began to include stories about group members in his presentations, which led to opportunities and connections for them. And he realized that they had created what Florence called a feedback loop of abundance, where each person's success amplified everyone else's success. One of the most moving examples of this collective field in action involved a woman named Ruth, who who was 72 years old and had been struggling to make ends meet on Social Security alone. And through the abundance circle, she met another member named Frank, who owned a catering business and was looking for someone to help with event planning, and Ruth discovered that she had a natural talent for this work, and within months she had built a successful event planning business serving the senior community. Another example involved a man named George who had been unemployed for 18 months and was becoming increasingly depressed and discouraged. And through the connections he made in the abundance circle, he learned about an opportunity to become a driver for a luxury car service that catered to wealthy retirees. And this work not only provided him with good income, but also restored his sense of dignity and purpose. Wesley told me that watching these transformations happen within the group was even more fulfilling than his own financial success, because he realized that he had become part of something that was literally changing lives and creating abundance for people who had given up hope. And he understood that this was what Florence meant when she taught that individual abundance is always connected to collective abundance. The principle that Wesley demonstrated in his life is what Florence called the law of collective manifestation. And this law states that consciousness is not individual, but shared, and that when a group of people focuses together on abundance, they create a field of possibility that is far more powerful than any individual effort could be. Florence discovered that this collective field works according to several key principles. First, when people come together with a shared intention to create abundance, they amplify each other's manifestation power through what she called resonance. And this means that each person's faith and expectation strengthens everyone else's faith and expectation. Second, when people share their abundance goals and challenges within a supportive group, they receive not only emotional support, but also practical resources and connections and opportunities that they would not have access to as individuals, and this creates multiple pathways for manifestation to occur. Third, when people witness each other's manifestations within a group setting, it builds faith and expectation for everyone, because seeing that abundance is possible for someone like you makes it easier to believe that it is possible for you. And this collective belief creates what Florence called a track in consciousness that makes manifestation easier for everyone. Fourth, when people celebrate each other's successes within a group, rather than feeling jealous or competitive, they create what Florence called an appreciation field that attracts more abundance for everyone, because gratitude and celebration are magnetic to prosperity. Florence taught that the collective field of abundance is one of the most underutilized tools for manifestation, because most people approach abundance as if it were a zero-sum game, where one person's gain must come at another person's expense. But she discovered that abundance actually works like love. The more you give, the more you have, and the more you celebrate others' success, the more success flows to you. She also taught that participating in a collective abundance field is not just about getting support for your own manifestations, but about contributing to the healing of humanity's relationship with money and wealth. And she emphasized that every person who breaks through their own financial limitations helps to break the chains of scarcity consciousness that have bound humanity for centuries. Florence believed that we are living in a time when it is possible to transform the entire planet's relationship with abundance, and that this transformation will happen through individuals who are willing to step into their own abundance, not for selfish reasons, but as a service to the collective healing. And she taught that this is the true meaning of prosperity consciousness: not getting wealth for yourself, but becoming a clear channel through which divine abundance can flow to bless the world. While you sleep tonight, you are connecting with the collective field of abundance that includes not only everyone who is currently working with these principles, but also everyone who has ever successfully manifested divine wealth, and everyone who will manifest it in the future. And this field is supporting your success, and your success will support others, and together we are creating a new reality where abundance is the natural experience of every human being on earth. As you rest in this sacred space where consciousness meets the infinite, I want to gather together all the wisdom we have shared tonight, like threads being woven into a tapestry of understanding. And as these threads come together, They reveal the full picture of what Florence Scovel Shinn discovered about the fire within the water, and how this ancient spiritual technology can transform not just your relationship with money, but your entire experience of being alive in this physical world. Tonight, you have heard about Evelyn, who learned that divine wealth is not money that comes to you, but fire that burns within you, and Harrison, who discovered that words aligned with divine truth have the power to rearrange external circumstances, and Maxine, who found that there are two completely different types of wealth, and that divine wealth flows from consciousness, not effort, and Vernon, who transformed his entire identity from poor man to wealthy soul and attracted circumstances that matched his new self-image. You have also heard about Lorraine, who dissolved the 7 patterns of resistance that had been blocking her ability to receive abundance, and Clifford, who learned to read the signs that indicate divine wealth is awakening in your experience, and Marlene, who discovered that divine timing is always perfect timing, even when it appears to human perception as delay, and Wesley, who created a collective field of abundance that amplified manifestation for everyone involved. Each of these stories illustrates a different aspect of the fire within the water. But tonight, I want to share with you one final story that brings together all of these principles in a single powerful demonstration of what becomes possible when you fully understand and apply Florence Scovel Shinn's teaching about the sacred paradox of abundance. And this story involves a woman whose transformation was so complete and so profound that it serves as the perfect culmination of everything we have explored together. Let me tell you about Gladys, who was 57 years old when she experienced what she later described as the great turning the moment, when the fire within the water became so bright and so powerful that it transformed not just her external circumstances, but her entire understanding of what it means to be a human being connected to divine source. And her story will show you the ultimate potential of these teachings when they are applied with complete faith and total surrender. Gladys lived in Richmond, Virginia, and had experienced more financial hardship and personal loss than any one person should have to endure. And by the time she was 56, she had been through a bankruptcy that cost her the small business she had spent 15 years building. She had gone through a painful divorce that left her with very little money and significant debt. She had struggled through a period of serious illness that had drained her remaining savings, and she had watched her elderly mother decline with dementia while trying to provide care that she could barely afford. When I first met Gladys in the autumn of 2017, she was working 3 part-time jobs just to cover her basic expenses. She was living in a tiny apartment that was clean but sparse, and she was driving a car that was 22 years old and constantly in need of repairs. And she told me that she had reached a point where she felt like she had nothing left to lose, and that maybe that was exactly where she needed to be. Gladys had tried every practical approach to improving her financial situation, and nothing had worked, and she had reached what she called the bottom of the bottom, where she was too tired to keep fighting and too desperate to give up. And it was in this state of complete exhaustion and surrender that she encountered Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings about the fire within the water. What made Gladys different from many people who learn about these principles was that she had absolutely nothing to lose and therefore nothing to protect. And this meant that she could approach the teachings with a level of openness and commitment that is rare, because when you have already lost everything, you are free to try anything. And Gladys decided that she would apply every single principle she learned with complete dedication, regardless of how strange or difficult it might seem. Gladys began her practice on November 1st, 2017. And she started by addressing her identity because she realized that she had been identifying herself as someone who was cursed or unlucky or destined to struggle. And she began speaking these words every morning. I am not a woman who struggles. I am a woman through whom divine abundance expresses itself easily and naturally. And I have not lost everything. I have been prepared for everything. She also worked on dissolving her resistance to receiving, because she realized that she had developed a deep unconscious belief that she did not deserve good things, and that if something good happened to her, it would inevitably be taken away, and she began, "Speaking these words, I am worthy of every good thing, and I do not need to earn abundance through suffering, and what comes to me through divine grace stays with me through divine protection." Gladys practiced recognizing the signs of manifestation, even when they were tiny and seemingly insignificant, and she kept a journal where she recorded every positive synchronicity and every small improvement and every moment of unexpected grace. And she practiced trusting divine timing, even when her external circumstances seemed to be getting worse rather than better. But most importantly, Gladys practiced what she called living in the fire within the water, which meant that even when her external circumstances were difficult, she maintained an internal state of abundance and gratitude and faith. And she would often say to herself, "The fire burns bright even when surrounded by the deepest waters, and the water cannot extinguish the fire, because the fire comes from a source that is beyond the physical world." For the first 3 months of her practice, Gladys saw very few external changes, but she noticed profound internal changes, and she told me that for the first time in years, she was sleeping peacefully at night and feeling hopeful during the day, and she had a sense that something wonderful was being prepared for her, even though she had no evidence to support this feeling. Then, in February of 2018, something remarkable began to happen, and it started with what seemed like a small coincidence, but which Gladys recognized as a sign that the fire within the water was beginning to manifest in her external world. And this sign was that she received a letter informing her that she was entitled to a tax refund of $1,234 due to an error in her previous year's filing. This refund was significant for Gladys because it allowed her to get her car repaired and to catch up on some bills. But more importantly, it was the first time in over 2 years that she had received money that she was not expecting, and she took this as confirmation that her abundance practice was beginning to work, and she increased her dedication to the spiritual principles. 3 weeks later, Gladys received a phone call from a woman named Patricia who had gotten her number from a mutual friend, and Patricia explained that she was looking for someone to help her elderly father organize his financial records and prepare for tax season, and she was willing to pay $25 per hour for this work, which was more than Gladys was earning at any of her part-time jobs. When Gladys met with Patricia's father, whose name was Robert, she discovered that he was not just looking for help with organization, but was actually looking for someone who could take over the bookkeeping for his small real estate investment business, and he offered to pay Gladys a monthly retainer of $800 plus additional fees for special projects, and this opportunity alone would replace the income from 2 of her part-time jobs. But Robert's offer was just the beginning, because word of Gladys's skills spread quickly among his friends and acquaintances. And within 6 weeks, she had 4 additional clients who needed similar services, and she was earning more money per month than she had earned in her previous business before the bankruptcy. And she was working fewer hours and enjoying the work much more. By June of 2018, Gladys had been able to quit all of her part-time jobs and focus entirely on her bookkeeping business, and she had moved to a larger apartment and bought a reliable used car and was beginning to rebuild her savings. And more importantly, she had discovered talents and abilities that she had not known she possessed, and she was feeling a sense of purpose and fulfillment that she had not experienced in years. But the most remarkable part of Gladys's transformation was still to come, because in August of 2018, she received a phone call that would change her life in ways that she never could have imagined. And this call was from an attorney named James Morrison, who represented the estate of Robert's sister, who had died unexpectedly and had left Gladys a gift of $50,000 in her will. The attorney explained that Robert's sister, whose name was Eleanor, had been so impressed by the care and kindness that Gladys had shown to Robert during his time of need that she had decided to include her in her will as a way of expressing her gratitude and ensuring that Gladys would have the financial security to continue serving people like Robert, who needed trustworthy assistance with their affairs. This inheritance allowed Gladys to expand her business and to purchase her own home for the first time in over 5 years, and to establish a substantial emergency fund that gave her a sense of security that she had not felt since before her business failed. and when I interviewed Gladys 1 year later. She told me that the most amazing thing about her transformation was not the external changes, but the internal changes that had preceded and enabled them. Gladys said that during the darkest period of her life, she had discovered something that she had not known existed, and that something was an unshakable connection to a source of supply that could never be threatened by external circumstances. And she realized that all of her previous financial struggles had been caused not by bad luck or external forces, but by her disconnection from this source. She told me that learning to live as the fire within the water had taught her that abundance is not something you have, but something you are, and that once you understand this truth, your external circumstances must rearrange themselves to match your internal reality. And she said that now, when she encounters challenges, she never feels hopeless or helpless, because she knows that the fire within her can never be extinguished. The most profound part of Gladys's story is that her transformation created a ripple effect that touched many other lives, because as her business grew, she was able to hire other women who were struggling financially, and she taught them the same principles that had transformed her life. And several of these women went on to start their own businesses and create abundance, not just for themselves, but for their families and communities. Gladys's story demonstrates the full power of the fire within the water when all of Florence Scovel Shinn's principles are applied together with complete commitment and total faith, and her transformation shows that no matter how difficult your circumstances may appear to be, there is always a way forward when you learn to access the divine abundance that burns eternally within your consciousness. Tonight, as you prepare to receive the final seal of this teaching, remember that Gladys's story is not unique, but is simply one example of what becomes possible when you embrace your true nature as a divine being, temporarily having a human experience. And when you learn to fan the fire of abundance that has always been burning within the water of your consciousness, every person whose story you have heard tonight was once exactly where you are now, listening to these words and wondering if such transformation is really possible. And each of them discovered that it is not only possible, but inevitable when you align your consciousness with the divine laws that govern abundance and allow the fire within the water to burn brighter and brighter until it illuminates every aspect of your life. Now, as we prepare for the final sealing of this teaching, breathe deeply and know that everything you have heard tonight has been absorbed by your subconscious mind and is already beginning to work in your life to dissolve old patterns of limitation and activate new patterns of abundance, and the fire that has been kindled within you tonight will continue to burn and grow stronger every day until it manifests as the abundant life you were born to live. Even if you are sleeping, something within you is completely awake and alert, and this part of you that never sleeps is the part that recognizes truth when it hears it and knows how to apply spiritual principles even when your conscious mind is at rest. And it is this awakened part of you that will receive the final seal of tonight's teaching and integrate it into every cell of your being. Breathe with me now and allow your breath to become slow and deep and rhythmic, as if you are breathing not just air, but the very essence of abundance itself. And with each breath you take, feel the fire within you growing brighter and stronger, and with each breath you release, feel any remaining doubt or limitation dissolving into the water of your consciousness, where it is transformed into fuel for the fire. You have journeyed tonight through 8 profound teachings that Florence Scovel Shinn discovered during her lifetime of service to those who sought to understand the spiritual laws of abundance, and each teaching has prepared you for this moment, when the fire within the water ignites completely and permanently, transforms your relationship with divine wealth. Tonight, you learned that divine abundance is not money that comes to you from outside sources, but fire that burns within you from an infinite source. And this fire has the power to transmute any circumstance of lack into an experience of plenty, because it operates according to spiritual laws that are more powerful than any physical condition. You discovered that your words are not just descriptions of reality, but are actually decrees that create reality. And when you speak words that align with divine truth rather than human appearance, You activate invisible forces that begin immediately to rearrange your external circumstances to match your spoken conviction. You understood that there are two completely different types of wealth, and that human wealth comes from effort and struggle and is always temporary and uncertain, while divine wealth comes from consciousness and alignment and flows easily and naturally and can never be lost because it springs from a source that is eternal and inexhaustible. You learned that your identity is not fixed by your past experiences, but is fluid and changeable, and that when you begin to identify yourself as a naturally abundant person rather than someone who struggles with money, you become magnetic to experiences and opportunities that match your new self-image. You discovered that resistance to receiving abundance is not a character flaw, but a natural protective mechanism that can be dissolved through awareness and practice, and that most people unconsciously block the very abundance they consciously desire because they do not feel safe or worthy of receiving it. You understood that divine abundance always announces itself through signs and signals that begin appearing long before the actual manifestation occurs in the physical world, and that learning to read these signs allows you to navigate the manifestation process with confidence rather than anxiety. You learned that what appears to human perception as delay or obstacle is actually divine timing, working to ensure that your abundance arrives at the perfect moment when all elements are aligned for maximum benefit and minimum resistance. You discovered that individual abundance is always connected to collective abundance, and that your success contributes to the success of others, while the success of others supports your own success. And together, we are all part of a field of consciousness that is becoming more and more magnetic to prosperity. Now all of these teachings converge into this final moment when the fire within the water reaches its full intensity and burns away every remaining vestige of limitation and fear and doubt, and lights the way for the abundant life that is your divine birthright. I want you to feel the presence of everyone whose story you heard tonight, and know that they are all supporting you in this moment of ignition and beyond them. Feel the presence of Florence Scovel Shinn herself, who discovered these principles over 100 years ago and taught them to thousands of people who went on to live lives of extraordinary abundance. And beyond Florence, feel the presence of all the spiritual teachers throughout history who understood that poverty is not spiritual and lack is not humble, and that your highest service to the world is to step fully into the abundance that allows you to express your gifts and fulfill your purpose without limitation. Now we begin the 3 waves of sealing that will permanently activate the fire within the water in your consciousness, and you do not need to repeat these words out loud, but simply allow them to enter the deepest levels of your being, where they will become living truth. First wave spoken softly like a gentle breeze that fans the flame. It is finished. The fire burns bright within the water of my being. It is finished. Divine abundance flows through me now. It is finished. I am connected to the infinite source of all supply. It is finished, and it cannot be otherwise. Second wave spoken with normal authority, like a steady wind that strengthens the flame. It is finished. The fire burns bright within the water of my being. It is finished. Divine abundance flows through me now. It is finished. I am connected to the infinite source of all supply. It is finished, and it cannot be otherwise. Third wave spoken with divine authority, like a powerful wind that causes the flame to blaze with unstoppable intensity. It is finished. The fire burns bright within the water of my being. It is finished. Divine abundance flows through me now. It is finished. I am connected to the infinite source of all supply. It is finished, and it cannot be otherwise. Now we seal your new identity as one who lives perpetually in the fire within the water, and these words establish your consciousness permanently in the realm of divine abundance. First wave of identity sealing, spoken with tender recognition. I am the fire within the water. I am divine abundance expressing in human form. I am the fire within the water. I receive easily and naturally from infinite supply. I am the fire within the water, and it cannot be otherwise. Second wave of identity, sealing spoken with growing certainty. I am the fire within the water. I am divine abundance expressing in human form. I am the fire. Within the water, I receive easily and naturally. From infinite supply, I am the fire within the water, and it cannot be otherwise. Third wave of identity sealing spoken with absolute conviction that penetrates every dimension of your being. I am the fire within the water. I am divine abundance expressing in human form. I am the fire within the water. I receive easily and naturally from infinite supply. I am the fire within the water, and it cannot be otherwise. And now the final sealing that locks these truths into your consciousness permanently and irreversibly. And so it is sealed in the fire that never dies, and so it is sealed in the water that always flows, and so it is sealed in the consciousness that transcends all limitation. And so it is sealed in the love that connects you to infinite supply, and so it is sealed. And so it remains, and so it continues to unfold in perfect divine order. And so it is, the fire within the water now burns eternally within your being. And tomorrow, when you wake, you will be different, not because anything external has changed, but because you have remembered who you have always been and what has always been true. And the abundant life that is your birthright will begin to manifest in ways that are more wonderful than anything you could have imagined. You can continue resting now or fall into the deepest sleep, knowing that the fire within you burns through the night and grows stronger with each breath you take. And when you wake, the water of your consciousness will be alive with the fire of divine abundance, and your life will begin to reflect this inner transformation in ways that will amaze and delight you. Rest now in the fire within the water. Rest now in the abundance that is your true nature. Rest now in the love that connects you to all prosperity. Rest now and let the fire burn bright. It is finished, and so it